So the first talk will be given by Monika Ankele, who is historian and also a postdoc researcher at the Medical University of Vienna, more specifically at Josephinum. Previously, she worked at the Institute of History and Ethics of Medicine at the University Medical Center in Hamburg and was also curator at the Medical History Museum. Her work and her research focuses on the material history of psychiatry and also its institutional cultures. And we could witness a couple of weeks ago one of her newest co-edited books and the launch of that book entitled Material Cultures of Psychiatry. The talk is also given by Céline Kaiser, who is Professor of Media, Cultural Studies and Scenic Research at the University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Ottersberg, Germany. As a Delphi Fellow of the Volkswagen Foundation, she has researched the cultural history of scenic forms of therapy since the 18th century. And her current focus is on medical humanities, artistic research, history, theory, and aesthetics of applied theatre, writing, and reading. Some of her most recent publications, and I'm going to read out the titles in German, are Szenen des Subjekts, eine kultur-mediengeschichtliche szenische Therapieform seit dem 18. Jahrhundert, and also Aufführen, Aufzeichnen, Anordnen, Wissenspraktiken in Psychiatrie und Psychotherapie. I'm not going to translate all of that, but suffice it to say that it is about sort of scenic forms of therapy and forms and practices of knowledge in psychiatry and psychotherapy. I know from Monika also that they've been working on the paper together, so actually meeting online and writing at the same time. So this is the beautiful practice that I've been talking about. And both of them also together developed a project on loneliness during the Corona crisis that is currently being reviewed by the Volkswagen Foundation. And last but not least, both of them are founding members of the International Association of Medical and Health Humanities and Artistic Research. And today they'll be talking about transparent boundaries. So I'm very much, or we very much looking forward to the first presentation. The floor is yours.
Okay, so transparent boundaries, material and performative aspects of dynamic boundary control in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the central challenges democracies have been confronted with since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic was and still is to make people behave preventively in the face of an invisible and intangible threat of infection. That means to behave significantly differently and to renounce many things that have characterized their lives up to now. We were able to observe around the outbreak site in Wuhan and other affected regions of China that apparently the pandemic can be contained quickly and efficiently through rigid intervention, complete isolation of infected people, and almost complete surveillance and control of the population's freedom of movement. But how do you motivate people to take similarly drastic steps voluntarily? More than that, how do you move human beings to respond to entities that are beyond their everyday spectrum of perception? In the 1920s, the perceptual psychologist Fritz Heider reflected on the fact that there are many things and phenomena that are either too large or too small in relation to human perception. In our everyday lives, we attach importance to those things that are in a suitable relationship to our senses. Neither the planetary nor the microbial are dimensions to which we usually attach significance due to the fact that we are able to relate to them and to act upon them. I quote, "Where there are only small entities," writes Heider, "there's nothing for us. A space filled only with air is empty. This must be made clear, that not everything that happens has meaning for us, that a great deal happens that does not rise up into our world at all. Quotation end. With this in mind, we want to draw attention to our in our presentation to the way in which the space of air and breath has been transformed in Western democracies in recent months into a so-called borderscape, where a regulation of the invisible has taken place, where the essentially undetectable has acquired meaning in order to modify actions and movements as well as human encounters. The concept of borderscape that points out that borders never simply exist, but are always produced by an ensemble of practices, material arrangements, and symbolic framings, is taken from the context of recent border studies and refers to the definition by Johann Szymanski, Chiara Brambilla, and Holger Pötsch. Focusing on the changes in our everyday spaces, one can put forward the thesis that the air and breathing space that we previously shared unquestioned has been transformed into a multiply marked borderscape that is constantly being recreated in bodily and performative actions. But how can one limit something that is everywhere? How can borders be made visible and practicable within the invisible, and at the same time interfere as little as possible with the routines of everyday life? In addition to the omnipresent face masks, glass and plexiglass in particular have proven to be highly demanded materials in the past year. They have become central for providing answers to these questions. Plexiglass in particular has spread rapidly in public spaces. Supermarkets, hotel receptions, taxis, restaurants, doctors' surgeries, clinics, even schools are arming themselves with panes in all sizes and shapes to make face-to-face encounters still possible, though this demarcation of boundaries. The fact that we are currently confronted with this multitude of transparent boundaries is no coincidence, as a look back into the history of medicine shows. In the following, we will highlight the establishing of boundaries in the historical context of clinical infection control, and take a look at the spatial and material arrangements that have been developed and discussed in the course of the history of Western medicine. We would thus like to move away from the linguistic discursive level and rather ask what material, spatial, and performative means contributed to giving meaning to the invisible and thereby transforming our patterns of action. How did the transference of a clinical border regime in an everyday world dominated by the pandemic affect our forms of interaction, encounter, and sensory perception? We will explore this aspect in a second and final step by focusing on creative responses to the manifold restrictions and challenges posed by the newly established borderscapes and selectively deepen them with a view to artistic works that were created during the pandemic and that deal with the connection between sensual perception and human encounter. I give to Moni. Monika, ich höre dich nicht.
Sorry. No, okay, once again. Clinical borderscapes and the transfer to the everyday. As is well known, the 19th century marked a groundbreaking change in the medical conception of infectious diseases. The way in which the relationship between bodies and their environment, between infection and the elements that seem to trigger it, changed. and so did the design of the spaces that were set up to deal with infectious patients. In the mid-19th century, anti-contagionists such as Florence Nightingale still defended the assumption that infections did not occur from person to person, but that bad airs, so-called miasma, caused diseases that could be prevented by extensive hygienic measures. Spatial separation of infectious patients was therefore not considered necessary because of the infected body, but primarily because of the infected environment. What was important was sufficient and continuous renewal of air in the wards. Thus, when hospitals were built, central attention was paid to technical solutions for the most effective ventilation. With the germ theory, the existence of microorganisms could finally be proven, and increasingly more pathogens were identified. With the knowledge of concrete germs that multiplied inside the body and not outside it, and spread through touch or the air, the bodies of the sick and the airspace that surrounded them were to be separated more strictly than before. So the concept of quarantine was not new, and contagious bodies were separated before, but the concept of separation was now based on new findings, and that's the difference. So according to architectural historian Jeannie Kisaki, quote, "Control the patient and you can control the germ," end of quote. This meant that the body and no longer the environment became more and more the focus of attention. Around 1900, with the establishment of infection pavilions, infection wards, and infection hospitals, physicians separated the infected bodies or those suspected of being infected from the non-infected bodies in order to prevent the multiplication of germs and their transmission. In 1914, the English physician Franklin Parsons dealt in his book titled Isolation Hospitals with the different spatial concepts in dealing with contagious patients. Concepts that had been developed since the germ theory has been established in the late 19th century. Parsons described in his book various forms of so-called aerial separation, which was supposed to configure the space around a sick person. If it was assumed that the invisible germs could spread over long distances, as Parsons called it, a complete aerial separation was carried out, and the sick were isolated in individual closed cubes. If the transmission paths were assumed to be shorter, it was sufficient to set up screens between the hospital beds in order to separate the air spaces of the patients from each other, as you can see in this picture. In general, according to the Hamburg building director Friedrich Ruppe in 1896, the sick rooms in isolation hospitals should have, quote, "an airspace for each sick bed, which should be larger than in wards for ordinary sick people." Comparable precautionary measures related to the interaction of people were found nowadays in the legal regulations with the concept of minimum distance. In German, it's called Mindestabstand, that were enacted in the course of the pandemic. But let us stay for a moment with the historical concepts of space, and thus with the historical models that also affect our pandemic present with the material qualities. In the history of preventing the spread of diseases in a clinical context, glass became an important material at the end of the 19th century. It was used for establishing boundaries in the clinical space to realize a complete aerial separation. With glass partitions, several adjoining cubes were constructed in the wards so that patients could be completely isolated from each other. You have seen this on the pictures before. As many hospital designers referred to the famous Institut Pasteur in Paris, where this arrangement was first tested, it was also known among them as the Pasteur principle. Apart from the fact that the glass walls were easy to clean and disinfect, they enabled both nurses and patients to have visual contact, which alleviated the feeling of isolation for the patients. This aspect received special attention when isolation wards were built in children's hospitals. Parsons pointed out that, quote, children who are apt to feel lonely and frightened in a room by themselves are contented if they can see other patients, end of quote. The erection of glass partitions also made it possible to maintain relationships between a possibly infectious patient and his relatives. So Ruppel reported in 1896 on the Presbyterian Hospital in New York that one of the visiting rooms was, quote, divided into two parts by a barrier with a low glass wall in such a way that the visitors who enter the room from the entrance corridor can see and speak to, but not touch, the relatives who enter the other part of the room from the central corridor. You can see this, you can see the ward in this picture here, and there in the middle is the small, or not so small, no, it's rather small visiting room. And this visiting room has a wall made of glass in the middle so that the relatives who visited their family members were not in danger to get infected, but had the possibility to see their family members. And another example is the Children's Hospital in Toronto, where the architect built a narrow, continuous balcony surrounding the buildings, a feature, as medical historian Anne-Marie Adams writes, intended to accommodate visiting friends and family. So similar concepts were reactivated in the wake of the pandemic, if we remember how visits in the homes for the elderly were made possible with the help of windows and glass or plexiglass partitions. So the use of transparent walls for the containment of the disease during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic could thus be based on approximately 100 years of experience with the separation of contagious patients and the division of airspaces in a clinical context. What is more, the spatial and material arrangements that had been tested and introduced in the clinical context for dealing with hospitalized patients were transferred to the everyday world with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in the Western democracies, in order to affect the behavior of the population as a whole, and presumably not only in the Western democracies, but that's where we focused on. So the fact that the far cheaper and less fragile material plexiglass has been available since the middle of the 20th century made it possible to make the clinical rearrangement a model for all kinds of social spaces. When the pandemic reached Europe and America in the spring of 2020, the demand for plexiglass solutions for cash desks and counters increased enormously. Even before the virus transmission routes had been clarified, and even before scientific proof had been provided that room dividers can protect against infection, check desks at supermarkets were equipped with panes of plexiglass. So glass and plexiglass have been preventively regulating human encounters to a great extent for a year and a half.
So I go on with the central orders. As smart and discreet as they appear, glass and plexiglass achieve something in this way that could not easily be produced without these spatial barriers. They probably appear as a minimally invasive intervention to all those people who orient themselves in space and coordinate their bodily movements primarily with their sense of sight. And yet they have an impact, function like transparent walls, are actants that influence the coordination of locomotion and movement sequences. Even if plexiglass panes enable visual contact, even if they guarantee the exchange of words in their spatial limitation, even if they have omissions that are placed for hand-to-hand transfer of objects, they obviously represent barriers in interpersonal contact. The fact that they alter sequences of movement and routines of action can be seen not at least in the attempts, particularly observable in the first months of the pandemic, to circumvent the materially drawn boundaries. people spoke alongside the plexiglass panes. They leaned forward or to the side, pushed their bodies between barriers, made contact above or next to the transparent barriers. The presence of glass and plexiglass in the space more or less subtly compels us to adapt our behaviors and patterns of movement to relate to a source or danger that may be present but is invisible and intangible. As already seen in the clinical space, they are materials that enable encounter on some levels and excluded on others in the context of infection control. An artistic work created in the pandemic year 2020 reflects this multidimensionality of plexiglass. As part of his Festival of Minimal Actions, the Viennese artist Thomas Geiger addressed the question of contact possibilities in times of pandemic by means of plexiglass. The artistic work is a reperformance of a work by Jiří Kovanda entitled Kissing Through Glass. Standing behind a glass partition in the Turbine Hall of the Tate Modern, Kovanda offered an invitation to break through the conventions of movement within the museum space by encouraging passers-by to stop and kiss him back on the other side of the glass. This is Kovanda's work. Geiger took up this performance and reconfigured it in the context of the pandemic. Instead of standing behind a pane of glass and waiting for passers-by to leave their walkways and approach him, Geiger himself took a portable plexiglass pane and approached passers-by in the streets of Vienna, offering them the chance to kiss him. The disc in Geiger's hands, disinfected again after each contact, paradoxically made the offer of intimate contact acceptable, as it was a portable boundary that made the social, symbolic, and infectious barriers surmountable. Transparent boundary management thus makes it possible to establish contact through gazes and, as Geiger's reperformance shows, at times also through touch. At the same time, however, this is accompanied by a new order of sensuality in our everyday lives. Some senses are privileged in social interaction, others are marginalized or disturbed in their usual interplay by being separated as dimensions of perception. The senses of hearing and touch are particularly important here in interplay with the visual sense. Sense of hearing. With regard to the acoustic dimension, a plexiglass pane as a room partition certainly enables the transmission of speech and thus of meaning. However, what it makes more difficult and, in view of the exchange of breath, is supposed to make difficult is conspiring, breathing with one another, and thus limits the spectrum of possibilities to connect paraverbally, bodily, and rhythmically through and with the other person. In her research on breathlessness, Jane McNaughton, professor of medical humanities at Durham University, has pointed to the eminently social dimension of breath, emphasizing that, quotation, breathing is also a social phenomenon through interaction with others. Breathing is the activity that coordinates bodies and time. It is what signifies the experience of the we, quotation ends. This dimension of conspiration in the context of the pandemic was addressed in a work by the British artist Lucy Seven. In her participatory art project Breathworks, she aimed at the importance of breathing and breathing together during the first lockdown. She collected audio recordings and assembled them into a video format and exhibition format. As the artist herself wrote in a contribution to the Medical Humanities online journal, The Polyphony, I quote, "As I move into the evaluation phase of this project, I begin to consider what breathworks might contribute to broader conversations about the becoming together of people, places, and the air that flows through both. I'm especially drawn to anthropologist Timothy Choi's reappropriation of the word conspiracy, which he describes as a commitment to breathing together from and in an unequally shared milieu. If to conspire means to breathe together with, then breathworks is a conspiracy of breathers, breathing together, yet uniquely." Quotation end. Her artistic exploration thus revealed levels and social needs that cannot be accommodated by the flexible management of borders with plexiglass panes.
Sense of touch. What the pandemic made clear in a relatively short time was the great importance of another sense that was restricted by the pandemic, the sense of touch, through which we satisfy the existential need for proximity and physical contact. Here too, the plexiglass pane drew an elementary divide. The impossibility of touching, of holding each other in one's arms, of taking each other by the hands, was especially challenging for patients who were in a hospital, suffering from corona and needed to be isolated. So what you see in this picture was the response of a nurse in the Brazilian hospital to this emotional and sensual deprivation that the patients had to face. She filled 2 plastic gloves with hot water, joined them together so that they enclosed her patient's hand, and in that way simulated the feeling of human contact. As the nurse Lidiana Melo said, quote, "I also hope that the patient feels that someone is holding their hand," end of quote. The fact that it is not only on the paraverbal acoustic level that interpersonal contact and interaction were falling behind, but also the sense of touch was thematized in 2020 by another Viennese artist, the dancer and choreographer Doris Ulich. In her pandemic version of a series of artistic explorations under the title Habitat, she looked for a way to make physical contact between her performers possible, so between people who did not, as was the law in Austria by that time, belong to one household. It was important to her to create an, as she called it, utopian place where bodies can freely interact, touch each other's sweaty skin and breathe together, what seems far, far away in view of the current pandemic, so Ulich. The guiding principle of her work was not only to adhere to the COVID-19 regulations, but to take them as a starting point to find new ways of connecting with each other. To establish such an utopian place, Ulich put her performers in full body sheets, as the pictures now show. Creative approaches along that line also circulated in the media. So-called hug curtains made of transparent plastic foil and fitted with leaves for the arms made possible what seemed impossible for a long time during the pandemic, if one wanted to get together risk-free. A border-keeping encounter with a physically perceptible and nevertheless protected physical contact. Designed as flexible and movable variants of the rigid window panes and plexiglass panes, they enabled, like Ulich's full body foils, a very physical encounter in the private sphere. So we come to an end. The First Embrace, that's the title of the photo that was chosen as the World Press Photo of the Year in April 2021. It shows how the 85-year-old resident of a Brazilian nursing home can embrace someone for the first time after 5 months of physical distancing. In this picture by the Danish photographer Mats Nissen, a hug curtain is also given a prominent meaning, which, together with the mask, is staged as an essential enabling element of this embrace. The closed eyes of the nurse reinforce the significance of touching, feeling, and sensing the other body, its heartbeat, its inhalation and exhalation in this moment. And at the same time, make clear how much these dimensions of encounter were missing in times of the pandemic. The photograph thus makes visible what an eminent role our sensory perception has not only for our actions and our ability to behave preventively towards invisible dangers, not only the creative strategies that have been tested in the course of the last months, but also the artistic works impressively demonstrate how much we, as social human beings, are determined by our sensory faculties. This seems to us to be an excellent moment to make a point and hand over to Kathleen Rice, who is going to look more closely at the meaning of touch. Thank you.